My name is Linda Crowther, and I went to university in South Carolina. I've been teaching for 42 years and currently teaching kindergarten.
My name is Anita Morgan, and I am school counselor at Laddie Core. I have my bachelor's in social work from Arizona State, and in 1999, I currently am a certified in school counseling and getting my master's through Ottawa. I have 2 years experience as a case manager, working with DCS, families who have had their kids taken away, and doing parenting classes, things like that. And then I have 2.5 experience as a therapeutic foster parent, and 12 years of volunteering in school in an elementary school environment, K-8.
My name is Giovanni Orozco. I am the school principal here at Laddie Core. I graduated from Alhambra High School here in the Phoenix area. I've been in education since 1997. I started teaching both at the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade levels, English, math, and then I have an Associate of Arts degree, bachelor's degree, master's, doctorates. I became a school principal back in 2007.
My name is Jeff Blake. I serve as the superintendent of Phoenix Christian Preparatory School, and I've been here all the way back since 1997. I've served, I think, about 27 years for Phoenix Christian, one way or another. Served as teacher, as coach, as assistant principal, and then now as superintendent.
So my name is Natoya Brown, and I am the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College Wellness Coach. I'm in school right now working on an EDD, but I do have a bachelor's in special education, and I have a master's in school counseling and a master's in clinical counseling. And I've been in education for 18 years, and I started off as a teacher and kind of moved my way through the more mental health route, school counseling, and then clinical counseling. And currently I serve as the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College Wellness Coach.
Johanna Youngblood. I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Education from a small Christian college in Chandler, International Baptist Bible College. I taught for 2 years at Ben Franklin Charter School in Gilbert, and I taught kindergarten there. I'm not teaching currently. Currently, I had to take a step back because of some health issues. I taught, started fall of 2020 until the end of the school year in 2022.
Free and reduced lunch,
Yeah.
low income. That does not necessarily mean that that's not a good reason for parents to not be involved, because we have a lot of wonderful parents who are hardworking and are low income. Mm-hmm. But sometimes that's the demographics. And then we also are in an area where there are several facilities for families that have fled.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, and those kids are only with us for a certain amount of time, and that is difficult. Yeah. I'll never get used to having somebody in the class and then all of a sudden they're gone.
One of the unique challenges of Phoenix Christian, it's a challenge and opportunity at the same time, is that we are a multi-racial school. We're a school of no majority. And so not only is there this beautiful tapestry of racial diversity here, we're a third Caucasian, a third African American, a third Latino. And then over behind me here is our international department. And there's about 20 to 30 students who are there from all over the world that come to be a part of Phoenix Christian. And so in that place, just uniting us, getting the students to focus on their academics and to succeed, helping keep them eligible for athletics, helping get them into college, and just kind of keeping the focus. And there really was a marked difference in my role before and after COVID.
Some bullying, getting along with others, as well as a lot of when I worked in K-12, a lot of sexual abuse, kind of some sexual trauma, a lot of that. I saw a lot of that um, pre-pandemic. So, yeah, I would say a lot of trauma with things that are happening in the homes of students, as well as some social and emotional concerns as far as anger.
Honestly, what we find specifically here at Laticor is a lot of our a lot of our issues when it comes to children mental health, children physical health, and even children learning is a lot of equity. And the reason why is because we find that a lot of investment is not done into our children and our families. Whereas you have with other communities who are a little bit better off, you have a lot of social communication happening. You have a lot of family relationships being strong. With our families, it's not so much. So there was a lot of TV watching or a lot of iPads or a lot of phone watching with our kiddos that we see that they've become the babysitters. The other component is that we see a lot of boyfriends or girlfriends watching children when they're not really watching them. And so that's something that we notice that the nourishment and the care and even the grace that's given to children is really lost, specifically when we see that. And I say this because it impacts not only their social and emotional growth, but also impacts their language growth. So a lot of our children, before the pandemic, before they would come here, a lot of the things that we had to work with them was how to be a good friend, how to speak to someone, how to express your feelings. With our little ones, it wasn't so much so it would resort into either violence or profanity, because that's all they knew how to do, and that was the only way that they would communicate. We face the same problems, academic, social and emotional trauma, but with different dynamics. And when I say that is because a lot of those, specifically when it came to the social and emotional learning, there was always a need for little ones, but it wasn't as stressed or it wasn't as acknowledged as it was after the pandemic. Regarding our little ones, the other component that we always focused on before the pandemic was the attendance factor. And again, they were always there, but they were not as aggravated. But after the pandemic, all of those things seemed to just become a powder keg where things just exploded. And the reason why is because not only did you find children staying home, but children being abandoned a little bit longer, you also found families who had emotional problems or mental health problems, whom, because of the pandemic, were made even worse. You have families that were barely hanging on, working a job, but because of the pandemic, they ended up losing their job, thus ultimately losing their homes. We found that with our little ones. The other one is we found a high levels of abuse. Again, going back to this idea of a powder keg, before the pandemic, it was something that was sustainable and I think was, I don't want to say acceptable, but people were able to somewhat cope with it. Once the pandemic hit, it felt that everything just within the home just exploded, where drug use, alcohol use, and child abuse became a common theme. A great example of that is before the pandemic, we used to make 5 at the most DCS calls throughout the year. After that pandemic, we jumped all the way to 30, 31. So there was an exponential amount of growth. The other component that we found before the pandemic was the idea of families and schools or organizations coming closer. Before the pandemic, it was, we're always trying to do some outreach, but after that pandemic, it became even way more difficult because folks were walking around with a lot of fear and a lot of misinformation regarding what the pandemic was, who the school was, There was even themes of the school was tracking families and tracking children. And so a lot of things just created a greater space for our families in our community, in our school here.
Prior to the pandemic, and most every year, the challenges that we face here in our demographics is getting parents involved and really getting on board with attendance, and not all parents, but some, with attendance and the need for them to be part of the team and to practice some of the things that kinders need to know by the end of the year. Things that we practice every day in school, but they need that extra help at home too. So that's a challenge. And not all parents are, there are a lot of parents that are involved, but that percentage of parents that they don't even look at folders, their things just accumulate. And you could just tell the kids that struggle a lot of times because parents aren't involved. I think we need a little more attention with educating families so that they understand the importance of their child being in school every day. And as I said before, the importance of being positive about learning with their kids. Not that they're negative, but they could be more positive at home and encouraging. Yeah, I think there needs to be that kind of education for parents, all parents. That would go a long way. How do you help your kids at home? Yeah. And I think the sense of the mental health of parents trickles down to the kids, because if the kids are seeing parents that are stressed out and unable to carry out life skills, and they've got various problems, it just affects the kids, which affects their learning. Yeah, that's why we try. It's really important for all teachers. I would challenge, it's really important for the classroom to be a consistent place, for it to be a safe place, a loving place, a fun place, because sometimes it's the haven. And that's what I saw a lot during the pandemic, that we could not do. They were not with us. Nothing takes the place of the home, but if a home is unstable and parents are angry and frustrated and there's just no order, it stresses the kids out. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to learn when you're stressed out.
The main problems with the education system stem from a much higher level than in each individual school and district, or it stems from the state level all the way down, as far as the prioritizing of funds for school, for what school needs and what school there's not enough teachers, and then you have the pandemic and that cut down so many teachers. As you know, there's a massive teacher shortage. Can't even get substitutes. The pay isn't nearly equivalent to other states. Again, it's at the state level that it comes down to where the funding goes to the districts, and the funding gets distributed at that point. And right now, the main issue is what the state is doing with their funds.
Before COVID, always funding is going to be an issue. One of the things that was before COVID, and then COVID accelerated it, was compensating our faculty and staff. Yeah. In transparency, we work really hard to keep within 85% of what the public schools are paying their teachers. And going into COVID, that was a challenge, and then COVID accelerated it as more and more people were leaving education, and the public schools began to ramp up what they were compensating public educators. That makes us building a really competitive salary structure challenging. So finding and hiring quality staff was a challenge going into it. Funding a regular curriculum review cycle, so we like to renew a portion of our curriculum that's on a cycle every 5 years, and making sure that that's funded. For a small organization like us, that's going to cost somewhere between $25,000 to $40,000 depending on the curriculum annually, making sure that we have that funded. and then making sure that we're taking care of our facilities. We have 20 acres, and we have tens of thousands of square foot of space. And for example, the building that you're standing by, that was built in 1951, and so older buildings require lots of maintenance and lots of funding to keep it up. And then kids are kids, and kids can be hard on things, and to make sure that we're endlessly keeping up with our facilities and keeping it looking sharp.
I've saw a lot of issues with educators, and a lot of my colleagues being teacher pay has been a huge issue, a huge concern. I was actually speaking with a friend who used to teach. She actually graduated from Arizona State University in probably 2002. And she actually ended up leaving and teaching, and she lives in California, and that's where she teaches. And anytime we bring up salary in Arizona, she always says, yeah, I would never go back. A $77,000 salary for an educator is half my salary as a teacher in California. And so, and so, that's kind of something that's always came up, and she always will say, yeah, I would never go back to Arizona to teach for that reason. So I've seen that as being a huge concern in education for a while. Teacher salary, support, the classroom sizes has kind of been a concern that I would see when I worked in K-12, and then just hearing some of my colleagues and what their concerns were in the classroom, that was a huge issue for them.
It was shocking. It was scary. I think that when we went into Zoom, it was so abrupt that all of us did not know how we were going to do it. And so we had to not only take in consideration the going into Zoom, but for us, we had to take the consideration of getting them the technology, because the technology itself was an issue. A lot of our parents do not have the technology or internet access, so we had to take that extra step. And another component that we had to take in consideration is when we would go into the home, how do we prepare when we see things that we're not supposed to see? So a great example of this is the transition was made difficult when teachers did not know how to take it when moms were getting dressed in the background while there was Zoom classes going on. How do we react to that? That made it difficult for a teacher. The other component is the transition was made difficult because a lot of our little ones would just fall asleep in Zoom. And there was no other adult to supervise them or stay with them. So that was another difficult aspect for us. And I think the other component that was made even more difficult is if we're bringing children here, once we start bringing them in via Zoom here, how do we keep ourselves healthy and safe? Because mind you, back then we didn't know what this virus would cause. And so we heard a lot of the horror stories, so everyone here was walking around with gloves, with masks, and just being afraid. And I think the last component is it took a toll. The transition was made difficult by the transition we had from being here to being at home. A lot of us do not know what it's like to work from home. So basically our whole schedule was thrown off, and our own inner clock was thrown off, where we even had to work and find ways of providing therapy for ourselves.
There was a lot of learning going on for teachers. A lot of things kind of thrown at you to do, and it was nobody's fault. It was necessary, but we were learning. We were learning how to do Zoom and do groups on Zoom, and then cameras in the room. It was literally, it was very difficult. And then you would get in front of the camera and definitely want to show that you were happy and excited. And so honestly, there were times that I was acting, going through the motions, because inside I was in turmoil with, oh man, I hope I can get this next slide without losing the class. I hope I don't accidentally cut off Zoom, So for me, I'm not a techie, like I said, a techie person. It was stressful for me. In retrospect, as I look back, I should have not let it get to me so much, because it ended up, we were okay. The challenge was keeping it new and fresh and keeping the kids engaged, because they weren't 5 feet from me. They were miles away. Not being able to have them as a group, and not letting, it was hard for them to have the social aspect, because they weren't with their friends.
Yeah.
That was challenging too. I can't remember if we did have a bit of a shortened day, maybe a break in the middle. I think that helped them.
Yeah.
But sometimes they wouldn't come back, so we hated to break too long.
Yeah.
In March of 2020, we were up in the White Mountains vacationing. We went into spring break. We had told our faculty and staff to have lesson plans ready that could be implemented remotely if needed. I think going into the spring break, none of the principals and I, we really didn't think that was maybe going to happen. And then by about Tuesday, Wednesday, going into spring break, we realized that we were going to have to pivot and change. And so I still remember we were up in the White Mountains on Zoom. None of us really knew at the time what Zoom really was. We used it here and there. We had just made a slight migration to Microsoft Teams. But on Thursday, I still remember sitting around over that phone and that conference call, and we decided to close down the school and shift to remote learning. And so we made that decision. For us, just what might be interesting and heartbreaking for us is that first, I came home, and I think that first week the kids had transitioned to online learning. That first week, one of our autistic students, we also have a program here called RISEN, which stands for Rising Individual Student Educational Needs, and that serves our special education population. One of our autistic students attempted suicide, and then a week later, a second autistic student completed suicide. And so we actually have a building over here, a room that we've dedicated in his honor. That was heartbreaking for us. Within 2 weeks, a week and a half, we had 180 pieces of technology donated, tablets, and many of our students, we serve a lot of lower income students, they didn't have technology. And so actually over there in our parking lot, we did a drive-through line for our elementary kids, middle school and high school lines where the teachers, and we had some retired volunteers come and help. Every kid kind of came through the drive-through line, we prayed over them, handed them their technology, handed them their curriculum, and all the kids, they had tears in their eyes, and they said they never thought they'd miss school. And so that was a really powerful moment. So that was part of that transition for us. We also, about 2 or 3 days later after we lost the student during the pandemic due to isolation, we did a drive-in memorial service for the kids in the parking lot. A local church had a radio transmitter, and we were able to put the radio into the kids could tune their radio in their car, and we did a little memorial service for the student that we lost. So then that was convicting. During that time, we got to, I met with the governor and Dr. Christ at the time and let them know how much mental health was paramount during this, and that the school was going to fight and advocate for mental health, and that we believed that the best thing to do is to have the kids here on campus and not isolate them, and yet still living within the unknowns that we all were swimming in of the pandemic. And so we, for the rest of that school year, we shifted to remote learning just for the rest of the year. And then at the end of the year, we did a drive-in graduation ceremony up at North Phoenix Baptist Church in their big parking lot. And we hired a massive production crew to have these big, gigantic production screens. And again, we borrowed the radio transmitters. And normally at a graduation, we have about 1,000 people kind of watch our kids graduate. Our graduating classes are around 50 kids. But that day we had, in the parking lot and people watching online, almost 3,000 people celebrated what went on. And we even got people like Monty Williams, from the head coach of the Phoenix Suns, to give a word of encouragement, and some local prominent pastors in the video. And the kids all got to sit, they separated, and they all got to walk across the stage. They didn't get robbed of that moment. And the same thing for our middle school. And then come August, we pivoted. We pushed back a little bit on some of the mandates, and we did half of the kids in the morning, half of the kids in the afternoon, and then we hired a crew to come in the middle of the day and clean for us. And we did that from the first day of school up until I think about late September, early October. And as things began to lift a little bit, then we let the students come back and we embraced masking requirements.
It was chaos. It was chaos because it was actually for the school I was at. We were getting ready to go on spring break the week prior. And when we went on right before spring break, we had like a brief meeting, like, hey, these were some things and talks if something happens, but we doubt anything's gonna happen and it'll just be business as usual. And so the plan was very, very loose. It really wasn't a plan. It was like, hey, these are some of the talks that's happening, but we don't think anything. And I was like, yeah, we'll see you next week. And then when we were on spring break, it was like, yeah, things happened really quickly and we are now everyone's scrambling to figure out what are we going to do. However, people are scared, like we can't be around each other. And so it was a matter of figuring out how do we get students, work with students. And it was pretty much chaos the first couple weeks because it was like, okay, we're extending spring break. That's really what ended up happening the first, I think, 2 weeks. Spring break was extended so we could have a solid plan to actually get computers out to students who don't have them and then go online and trying to create a classroom system that was online. And then counseling that was online was very different because it wasn't something that we did at the time. It wasn't something that I did. You know, I never met with students virtually ever until COVID. So, so that was something very different for all of us. And then transitioning from, okay, this is what school looks like and what life looks like to we all have to evolve and figure this out. And here's my Calendly to schedule. And so that's when I was actually familiar with Calendly because I have a business and my business used it. So that's how I was familiar with it. And so I created a link so students could schedule with me virtually. And so it was a little bit smoother in that sense because I was familiar with the online platform already. And then students would schedule appointments and then I would be talking to them. However, 95% of the things that we were talking about at that point had nothing to do with school. And it was pretty much, we were triaging stress-related concerns, grief and loss because family members were passing away for students and helping students cope with that, helping students who didn't have food get access to food. And so the concerns were more survival. It was more of their basic needs and emotional needs. It had nothing to do with academics at that point.
Probably, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, probably those kids of lower income with less accessibility to basic needs. Where again, like I said before, our school did step in and do a lot of that kind of help, not just with the academic things that they needed for school, but food and there were a lot of things made available to them. But I would say that's probably the biggest. And then medical things, I don't know a lot about that, but I know it was hard for some of our folks here to have medical attention, get to places because of transportation.
I can only speak for our little ones, and I can tell you that the population that struggled the most are the ones that were either parents whom either were not involved before or parents who had 2 or 3 jobs. And I say that because they didn't have the luxury of having grandma or having dad or having another adult right there by their side. The other ones that struggled the most were kiddos who did not have a specific older sibling, such as a 7th or 8th grader that could be with them, because they were left on their own and they had to make sense out of things.
The ones whose families are completely separated, whose parents broke up, whose parents are estranged from each other, those ones that don't have parents who want to engage in the school, those ones struggle the most because a lot of parents broke up between the pandemic and now, and we're seeing the side effects of that with these kids. They don't want to leave one parent, they don't want to leave the other parent, and so they're throwing fits. They're doing all sorts of things to not go to school, not be in school. Once they get here, once they get in their class, they'll be fine. But getting them to do that is really difficult, and it stems from the most challenging ones are the ones whose parents split up.
You know, that's interesting. We serve a large number of students from lower socioeconomic background. And I would say take money out of it for me, my experience, my observation. The principals may answer a little differently than me. But for me, my experience would be the students who didn't have a stable household. And that accountability, that culture of accountability in the home is where I saw the kids struggling the most.
Actually, I feel like all of our students were struggling.
Yeah.
They were just struggling in a different way. Our teachers were struggling. So I don't necessarily think it was a population. I think everyone was struggling. It just looked different for different people. Whether some of our families were more affluent, they may have had the resources, but they may have been struggling emotionally. Then you were having parents who were separating and getting divorces because they were stressed out. And then you had the dynamic of them having to be around each other, and that created tension, and then they're stressed, and then the kids are stressed. And so then you have kids who are dealing with that. And then you have kids who are, you know, I in particular had a student who, you know, they didn't have to be around at the time. We didn't know this. They didn't have to be around their abuser. And then when they were put in an environment where they had to live with their abuser 24/7 because of COVID, then that created a whole nother layer of issues. And I felt like I was contacting DCS all the time. I was really just, it was kind of like putting out fires, contacting DCS. Some kids we can't even get a hold of. Once things opened up a little bit, in the fall, I was actually making home visits and kind of trying to talk to students through screen doors with masks on, and trying to stay safe, but also checking in to make sure our students were safe because of some of the things that were going on. So counseling, the world of counseling and school counseling completely shifted. Yeah, and it's because their whole system, their family system was completely, some of them destroyed.
Yeah.
Some of them, it looked a lot different. Some of their systems that they were accustomed to shifted so drastically and so quickly that you were trying to cope with all of these things. And it's very hard for a teacher to then come in and teach when you have all of these immediate concerns that students are dealing with. Our lives are so busy, where COVID caused things to slow down and caused people to have to spend time with each other and have to address problems and issues and concerns that were already there. And that kind of blew up for a lot of families because they weren't used to having to deal with those things and address that. And so that kind of caused this domino effect that ended up playing out over years. Over the last couple of years, we still see the effects and the impact of that. Families, you know, the divorce rate after COVID went up. And that's because that's just some of the domino effect of some of the things that were happening.
I think the biggest thing was relying on them, letting them know that, you know, we're all going through the same thing. I know that there were a lot of tears during the pandemic, and specifically when the year was over, and the reason why is because all of us were wondering what just happened to all of us, what just happened to our school. And so just relying on them, and believe it or not, the biggest thing that I realized is that when there's a challenge or there's a struggle, there are people that usually rise to the occasion. And so those people we developed, and I developed and helped them because I needed their leadership.
I appreciate that. Well, first, from a Christian perspective, we believe in the body of Christ. And in the body of Christ, there's lots of different giftings within the body. And for me in particular, my job was to listen to the wisdom of, say, for example, our high school principal, who is a very gifted logistical thinker. And then our elementary principal was very much kind of a heart-driven, relational-driven person. And the three of us sitting down and embracing the gifts of each other to think through it. And then in humility, standing in front of the faculty and staff and saying, team, I don't have all the answers here. We're going to figure it out. We're going to meet daily, and we're going to keep updating. I think what I remember, we were just reflecting on this last week. I remember almost every evening when we brought all the kids back, there would be some kind of case of exposure. And then we'd sit down, all right, who was that little one around, or who was that big one in the case of the high schoolers, who were they around? Walk through the exposure list, reach out to their parents that night in an email and a phone call, and then quarantine them. And I think that was every night, so that was regularly every night, like at 9 o'clock. It was always 8:30 or 9 o'clock when a parent would say, my son or daughter just tested positive for COVID. Then we'd quarantine them. And so just a lot of humility and putting one foot in front of the other. And I literally thought families were going to begin to withdraw from the school because it costs money to go here. And that parents were going to say, "This, why are we paying for something that's remote? Well, we could do the same thing through other online platforms." But our parents, we actually grew in our enrollment.
Wow.
And parents seemed to value even more what's going on here. And so that was a shocker to me.
Yeah.
It was hard, but it was just humility, perseverance, put one foot in front of the other, and trust. And my school board, they didn't know. And they're looking at it from all the different angles. They're looking at it from the business side of the school. Are we going to be able to weather this storm? But they too were very supportive, and I gave them a monthly report. This is what we're, honestly, a weekly report. This is what we're doing. This is how we're pivoting.
We were expected to log on 7:50 to 8:30, and then take a break at 11, come back at 12 o'clock, and then log off at 2:30. What we realized is that many of our little ones were not logging on, and we would be calling. And then once they took a break, they would not come back. And so our biggest struggle was trying to keep them on Zoom, learning while the teacher was teaching. And even then it was not that effective. Zoom for 7 or 8 hours is not, it's not something human beings are built for. And so especially with our little ones, that technological piece or that disconnect between human beings was so difficult on them that they didn't know how to cope. And the other one is the supervision. There were times when we've had, parents that would leave their little ones being taken care of by their 7 or 8-year-old brother or sister. And so sometimes they would log on, sometimes they would not log on. And there were times again with supervision where we had a little one call the cops. We had a little one tell us that there was someone trying to break in their house. So I had to drive over there while the counselor was on the phone with the cops just to make sure that this little one was safe, because she alerted us on Zoom. And so those things we were not prepared for. Because without a doubt, if a little one's crying, or we had another incident where the little one, the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old were taking care of each other, but next thing you know, they have a 2-year-old that they were taking care of. The 2-year-old steps out of the apartment and they couldn't find her. So school was thrown off, and because we saw this little 5-year-old disappear, and we asked, where's the adult? No adult, so we had to go over there and find where all these 3 kids are, something that we had not calculated into our formula.
It was not anything I expected it to be, but it was also, in some ways, it was like I didn't, as a first-year teacher, I didn't know what was normal. Like I knew that virtual teaching wasn't normal, but for a lot of the other teachers, like it was a huge stress for them because they're used to having a certain routine. And I was younger, and so we used Google Classroom for our videos, for teaching, for adding assignments, for communicating with kids. And like I could do all that very easily. Some of the older teachers had a little more issues or had a little more trouble just even like navigating it. Obviously we all had technical difficulties. But in a lot of ways it wasn't, it was still stressful. But it was almost like I didn't know any better. So yeah, it was almost like we were all starting from that first year teaching again, because it was all new. But I didn't come into it with like the stress of like, oh, everything that I already had set in place has been disrupted because I had nothing set in place before. to make it through that COVID time when we had to be online, in my school, we did see, we had a lot of support because we were given a structure and an expectation of this is how we want you to run a online class. So if they're like barely making it or struggling, then it's just going to add on. And so the first grade classes, that 2021, sorry, that 20, yeah, what is it? No, that 20, yeah, that 2021 year struggled. A lot of the kids came in at a low level or they were struggling. And it was like that with all of the grades though. So that was really hard because yeah, we just kept on chugging along, but that meant we're, you know, in some ways you're dragging kids along and they're just not ready. They needed more support there.
When the pandemic started getting over and people could go into the classrooms, I was a substitute teacher as people were starting to go back into classrooms. Some people were still on virtual. The kids were coming back basically at the end of the school year, so they came back mostly for the fourth quarter. So you've got a bunch of kids in all areas of the in K through 8 that basically are starting in March, and they're acting like it's August because they have to learn the classroom rules, they have to learn all the expectations and things like that. And so it was crazy.
Top of it, you know, everyone's wearing masks and we have all these like, don't stand too close to your friend, and you know, you can't go by your friend's desk, and we have to be this far apart, and just all these different, and they can't see my face. Sometimes I'd wear a shield so they could, but I couldn't see their face. So different stuff like that. So it was chaotic for them. Just a little emotional, but a lot of them were excited. The ones that I had, they were excited. I think a lot of kids were, especially those first few months, just to be back. You're setting expectations for this stage of COVID, and then for this stage of COVID, and then all these different things that take time. It was hard actually seeing where they were. That was hard too, because it's like, oh wow, we have a lot to catch up on.
Here it's getting better because it's more normal. Okay. You know, for teachers, as I told you before, you know, it was difficult for teachers too. So every year has gotten better. We're back to normal. I'd say everything's back to normal. There may be some things that I don't know about. I'm sure there are, but as far as the classroom goes, kids are the same. They're learning the same. They're happy. They're progressing, thriving, really. So, and I think definitely teachers are happier to have the kids back in school. Well, certainly there were different times of COVID too, times where we were an island, right? And then there were the times that we were on campus with our teacher friends, our friends here, and some kids were here. So all of those situations helped to get better, but yeah, that we're all much happier being here at school.
But I just noticed overall though, and I was talking about this with some of my other peers, that were, or some other teachers that were teaching like in their kindergarten classes, we all like, we had some hard classes that second year. It just seemed like, especially in kindergarten, a lot of the kids were academically struggling, and they were just like, usually kinders, there's not in a manipulative way, but it's very easy to motivate them. They're excited to be in school. They're like ready to learn, and they can take in a lot of stuff. And we were just seeing a lot of kids were coming in that needed IEPs already. And there was a lot of kids that had short attention spans or had a hard time just, you know, following along. Maturity level. Oh my goodness, so many of them. When you're in kindergarten, the maturity level, there is a range, but there was a very stark difference between these kids are still on this level. these kids are on like what a regular 5-year-old is. We had a lot of kids that were on like, they're still acting like they still have that 3-4-year-old maturity mentality. There's already a pull to have to feel like you have to entertain or make everything entertaining or engaging. And that's fine, especially at 5. But it was even more so like we have to constantly keep it at this high engagement, high entertainment type level to get them to learn.
Honestly, at the beginning of the year, the only thing that I would say was evident, perhaps attributed to COVID, was a little bit of lack of vocabulary and ability to articulate their feelings, their fears. But that didn't take too long to fix itself. Just a little bit of time, and they were able to communicate well. That's on these littles, because they would have been 2, and so I don't think necessarily they would feel so much of the effects, where I think, and I've heard it affects more the older kids. I know my husband teaches older kids, and he can definitely see the social aspect hurting, that those days of COVID affected their social. A lot of them would rather stay home and show up once a week so that they can keep their place in school. And that's a new thing. It did not happen to the degree that it happens now. But with the young kids, they're so resilient, and once they get into a safe environment, a happy place, they thrive. So I can't say that our current kinder and kinder kids have, I don't see a ton of effect.
Yeah.
Just maybe the vocabulary and that initial entry of school.
Trauma has impacted all of our children, and I think that because of COVID, it has been expanded. And so a lot of our children, we even have some children that are dealing with the loss of a parent. And so that's something that, while we've confronted before, it was never because of COVID. Or we've had children who now are dealing with parents who are disabled because of COVID. And so that's another situation that we're confronting. The other thing that I feel that has been impacted the most with our children here is they're coming to us with a lack of language and an inability to be able to cope. And so a lot of their emotions are pretty raw, whereas before we would have those coping mechanisms, we would have those words with the families would be even way more involved. Now it's a little bit different, because the families now have either resorted to moving or going homeless, or the families have resorted to other habits because of what happened during the pandemic. A lot of people don't realize that during the pandemic, not only were children affected, but the older adults the adults were affected, thus having a trickle-down impact on them, because their coping, or their inability to cope, basically became their vice or their bridge to using other things. The one thing that we've seen a huge rise in is the usage of alcohol, where because it's not so much frowned upon within our society, it's more becoming a little bit more prominent, and thus we're observing it with our kiddos.
For some students, it made them not care about academics anymore, because they didn't have Wi-Fi, they didn't have, for whatever reason, their parents didn't enforce anything with the virtual learning. And then they get to school and it's all crazy because there's not enough teachers, and there's not enough substitutes, and there's not enough stability in their environment at school. And so there's a lot of kids, especially in the middle school, especially, and in high school too, who just don't care anymore. Then you have the kids who struggle with, separation anxiety from their parents, separation anxiety from their loved ones. Maybe they had a lot of loved ones die during the pandemic. Maybe they had several. They struggle being away from their family unit. So there's a lot of components that go into it.
One of the indirect impacts, and I talk a lot with heads of school from all across the country. I'm really connected with the associations that we're a part of, and one of the things that we're all hearing and all sharing is that when our workforce in schools came back from COVID, there was a decrease in capacity, how much people could hold and manage and do. There was a fatigue, kind of a fog that came back. Without question, we've seen in our math scores, I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. Our math scores took a dip. And we've doubled down on standardized testing and examining the data and reinforcement data. We've doubled down in providing intervention places for kids and extra support. But even though we're investing, we've hired more staff, we've hired curriculum, we've redone our curriculum, we've redone testing, we've done interventions, special classrooms for kids that are struggling. It's still low.
I noticed a lot more lack of motivation, stamina, of just attention span or being able to complete tasks, just stuff like that. I noticed that a lot more actually my second year. That was kind of what a lot of other teachers were noticing, not that first year, but that second year. Being around your peers and social interaction helps you develop a higher maturity. And so they probably didn't have a lot of that between the ages of 3 and 4 because they were at home. And unless they had a sibling, then some of them were only children where they had one other sibling, and definitely noticed a difference with those ones, especially because they're only around maybe mom or maybe dad.
That we can close the school in a heartbeat. That God provided through it. That we work together and we figure it out. It's never going to be perfect. It is never going to be perfect. I'm going to point over here, up there is our middle school. When those kids came back from middle school, we struggled more than anything with the middle school. The kids weren't ready to learn. They weren't ready to settle down. The teachers were worn out. And I made some difficult decisions with the staff. A couple positions I had to change. And I hired a special middle school principal. And honestly, one of the things I learned, I didn't have it in the budget. I took a step of faith, hired 2 new staff, hired a new principal. And one of the most thriving parts of our school right now is that middle school. And I realized kids need relationship, individual, they need a shepherd. Public, private, call it what you want. Kids need a shepherd, they need to know standards, they need to know expectations, and they need to know you love them. And that we're all here to raise them to the next level. And so I thought, as unruly as our middle school was, I thought we were going to hemorrhage kids and families were going to withdraw their children. I had about 90 kids at that time in the middle school. And so if I lose 30 kids, that's well over $250,000, a part of our revenue to make the school run. And what I found on the other side of that, and just some intentional leadership, particularly from our middle school principal, that middle school next year is going to be up close to 150 kids. And so it's getting close to doubling in size. And just watching God's provision and faithfulness. And again, as a Christian, on my knees in prayer, God, I don't know what to do here. I need help. Guide us through it. And God provided for Phoenix Christian.
The biggest part is by empowering and training our teachers. I know that when we first came back, that was one of the things that we pushed for here at Latticore, that trauma-enforced teaching. And the reason why is because our teachers did not know how to take these kiddos. And even the teachers themselves did not know how to take themselves because they themselves were recovering from it. The other thing that we did is we empowered our social worker and our counselor to even be more into the business of anything that happens with our children, where it's no longer just you see the principal, it's no, you see the principal along with a counselor, along with a social worker. And so that's been a whole new dynamic for us, because we know that when we see the children, it is no longer the children individually, it is the family. And so what we're finding is when we meet with those children and the families, we are connecting them to services. So that's how it's changed all of us. The other component is we've been a little bit more reflective when it comes to us as teachers. What we've been pushing here at Laddie Core is we are no longer just teaching academics, we're teaching about ourselves and who we are. Because what we've asked teachers to do is be reflective and acknowledge when they are having an off day. And the reason why is because it impacts the child. What we've learned is that teachers have a certain capacity that they could take, and then they are done. And so rather than getting them to that point, we try to reach out to them before that.
I think that people, yes. So yes, I think that educators, people in general give more grace than they want. I think sometimes it can be a little too much. So I think there's definitely like a sweet balance that needs to kind of happen with that. But it is nice to see that, you know, people want to, admin, instructors, want to help students be successful. And so they're willing to give them grace and understand that they're struggling in different situations that may be, you know, something we didn't necessarily give as much grace for in the past. So I think that's a huge difference and something positive that came out of COVID.
There's a kindergartner, and now in 2022-23, so in 2022 she came in as a kindergartner. So you think during the pandemic she was what, preschool 2 or 3? But at that point her family was homeless, so they were homeless. Then there's the shutdown, there's all of that, then her mom's sick, and her mom gets terminally sick. So this student comes into kindergarten and won't go into class, will not go into the classroom. So having meltdowns, throwing, hitting, cussing, the whole 9 yards. Still won't go in the classroom. And we've been able to, over the past 3 quarters, gradually get it so that this child feels safe in the classroom, that she feels, now they have an apartment and her mom is in and out of the hospital, but they're finally able to be stable, more stable, and the child is now staying in the classroom. She very rarely has fits, and she's learning, and she's actually making friends. She wouldn't make friends, she wouldn't talk, she wouldn't do anything at the beginning of the school year. Families have everything to do with it. If a family's not engaged or doesn't understand what's going on, or is fighting everything, or just doesn't care, doesn't communicate. I've got another kiddo, we had a meeting today, who's missed over 68 days of school. He's missed more days than he has been attended. Mom just doesn't see it as a priority. With that one, you know, Mom started crying, and hopefully she'll get it, but she's going to have to meet with the probation officer to explain to her why this is important. And then you have families who, you know, are struggling in life anyway, but they're here every day, and that mom comes to the meetings and takes them to tutoring and does that. And those kids, their academics are going up because the parents are involved. And the parents, you know, and so our job is to really try to connect these parents to the school unit, so to realize that it's not just leave your kid here and go do your thing. It's all we work together, and then we can help support them too. Well, our school's neat because we have a social worker and myself, the school counselor. So I'll focus a lot on the kiddos and what's going on in the school, and the school social worker will come along and support the families where they need by giving them clothing donations, food boxes, a lot of times just working with them to fill out papers that can help them with housing, that can help them with financial needs, that can help them with whatever they need. Just really coming alongside. And we also have a therapist that meets on campus too, that can pull the kids into small groups. And that organization will actually is an outside organization, so that will do family counseling and things like that as well. So we offer so many supports to our parents to help them and ultimately help these kiddos.
So I've seen a lot of our students who are, you know, who are in college now were sophomores and juniors at the time. And those students have been at home online, some for 2 years, some stayed. And then they got here, and a lot of them, there was a huge deficit in social emotional growth, where I have students sometimes that will say, how do I make friends? And some of those skills are just taught, not necessarily taught, they're learned through some of the interactions students have in K-12 settings. And so there's some deficits at the college level because students miss that the sophomore, junior, and senior year. They also, students, because of COVID, there was a lot of grace given to submitting assignments and doing this, and it's okay, and I'm going to help and I'm going to support you, which is great. But now students kind of expect that same type of treatment, and it's very difficult when you're on a large campus at a university. I would say the same level of concern right now is students are still struggling with the same things that they were struggling with last year, post-COVID.
I think as it progressed, as the pandemic progressed, it got old. You know, I could see the stress of parents having all their kids at home, and that got a little more challenging. So it was fun at first for the kids, but it was very hard to keep them, their attention. Yeah. I'm pretty animated, but it was still hard because of things going on in the background. Yeah. Noises and all kinds of things we saw.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of unknown, and parents are at home and they're stressed, kids are stressed, and then sometimes that stress would bubble out here, frustration, disappointing of losing a senior prom, or disappointment of, we know we had a state-bound baseball team. It was probably a state title team, and those kids have been playing together since they were 8 years old, and here they are 18 years old, and that season was robbed from them. And just frustration and stress, and the teachers were under stress, parents are under stress, and it just took a lot of grace with one another, and just guiding the parents in a steady hand, and regular and constant communication with an outside ministry organization, Heart for the City, that will go out and pick kids up, bring them in, and they operate as a liaison between the parents and the school, and so then you have a couple layers there. But honestly, during that time we did a ton of Zoom town hall meetings, share our heart, we're here to help, and then parents in their frustration, they were just reaching out for help. I wish we'd have known that more in the moment when they were upset and they maybe were barking at the school a little bit, that it was just a cry for help.
I do worry about those kids that were alone so much and have not gotten out of that cocoon I worry about that.
I'm more nervous about that in our state. We're not, these kids and these families aren't going to get the help that they need because there aren't enough people in those positions to help them. So there's not enough, you know, from teachers and staff, but I mean, even in like the healthcare field, and that there's not enough housing, there's not enough people to at the hospital to do tests for adequate diagnoses for autism, for ADHD, all that stuff. People, the wait list for all these services is exponential. It's, you know, it takes minimum 6 months to a year and a half wait just to get anything done.
One of the things that concerns me is, you know, there's a billboard I drive by every day on I-17 where Phoenix Union High School is letting us know what their starting salaries for teachers. Osborne School District, who's where we're at. Some of the more affluent Christian schools that they're in different parts of town, other than your urban core here like Phoenix, they're attracting different populations, and they're able to charge more for tuition, and then in turn compensate their. For me as head of school, it's the funding side that it's got my attention, keeps me awake, and keeps me praying, making sure that they're fully supported.
I see a lot of students who are mental health is huge, and I know we hear a lot about it now. It's a huge issue at the higher ed level. It's a huge issue. Students don't have coping strategies. Students need to be taught that. Students need to know it's okay to get help. And so I think that's a huge concern. And there just needs to be a lot of supports, a lot of strategies that students can know about early, a lot of resources that they can have access to early, and that they're there, but students need to understand and know that they can go get them and how to get them, because that is a huge issue. I think mental health is going to kind of play a role in a lot of what we see. I think it already is. So students knowing how to cope when they're stressed, when they're angry, when they're mad, when they're frustrated, when they're overwhelmed, know who to go to, know how to get there, know where counseling is, know how to get counseling resources, know I can just talk to someone, know that it's okay, and actually do that, so that they can get help, because sometimes students don't get those resources and don't get help, and it's just a domino effect that affects them in more ways than one, and even affects other people in some instances.
The relationship between the families and I. Going on my 8th year here, I've never had such a solid relationship with our families where it's become to the point where I could call them out on different things. I feel that if you're able to correct people, you must have that relationship. And that's what I've been able to do with our families. I'm always amazed and always humbled when I see different people take on different tasks and just thrive with them. And just watching them grow. That I love seeing, because I know in the end is something that is good for our school. I'm part of the community myself. I live in the community, so it allows me to get connected and get closer to them, so that way I can see them every weekend and know and hold my head up high, know that I am working very hard for them.
I love that I get to, so education's huge for me. It's very important to me, but when I worked in education as an educator, as a teacher, let me say it that way, as a teacher, I realized that there was just more to it, a lot of things that students needed that impact their learning. And so I love that I get the opportunity to support students with those other areas, the wraparound services. I get to support the social and the emotional. I get to support the student that lost a loved one. I get to support a student that's going through a really tough time, that's going through a divorce. And I absolutely love doing that, because that impacts everything. That impacts retention. That impacts their academic success, that impacts graduation rates. The things that the students don't talk about with everyone else that I get to talk to them about is what impacts how well they do. And I absolutely love being able to do that and support them and give them tools that they get to use. And not only do they get to use it for themselves, but later my hope is that it's a domino effect and they get to support their students and they get to take some of these breathing tools with them to teach their classroom, teach their students how to cope, teach their students how to self-regulate, and teach their families and their kids. And so my hope is that it just starts with them and it's like this flower that just keeps blossoming and, you know, depositing more seeds, and it just grows. So I love that part of my job.
You know, I think I mentioned that we lost a student. I think I realized what a sacred and powerful role of just being here and providing a stable environment for kids to come and be a part of. It's hard. It's now May, and these kids have 3 weeks of school left, and they're wiggly and they're ready to be done. And they may not be honoring dress code as much as we want. They may not be, although right now they're in class, which is a good thing to see. And the teachers are starting to run out of gas a little bit. But just the power of a stable environment that provides a loving environment for kids to launch life. And I'm never going to take that for granted. And I felt like God was saying, keep after it. It's messy. It's hard. Every day has its own challenges. It's never perfect, but keep fighting and keep serving.
Awesome. I love not just being with the little people, the little kids and stuff. I love being able to help these kids, help these teachers, help these families grow stronger and get more skills to get what they need to be successful. It just, my heart goes out to them. So I love what I do. I do a lot of, I'm everywhere all at once, but it's fun.
Because we do little kids, when they come in, a lot of our kids, it's like wet sand. I tell people it's just, you know, the beach moves away and it's blank. But the impressions that we're able to have on their lives and just the growth that we see from the first week of school, where some of them don't even know their name. They don't know letters. They don't recognize, to the end of the year where they're able to articulate their thoughts, their fears, their joys, their questions. They can read, they can write, they can interact, you know, with each other. Those kinds of things, to see that is pretty amazing. Because there's a ton of growth from 4-year-olds to 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. We're the foundation here. So that's a big joy. I think you know, with experience, a big joy is seeing those kids grow up and even teaching their kids, you know, seeing them successful, going out into our town and seeing those people in different places or coming back to us and they're successful adults. That's thrilling.
Yeah.